Before I begin actually describing my outline, I should maybe describe a little bit my process for creating outlines. And I came up with a process that I like for campaign design that is kind of a hybrid of two other processes that I've seen that are published, in fact. The first one is the Dungeon World fronts. Dungeon World is I believe it's a powered by the Apocalypse game with a D&D-like vibe in particular. And it is kind of famous for this fronts method where you have fronts. They're kind of like storm fronts is where the name comes from. But what they are is basically things that NPCs or bad guys or villains or monsters or whatever are doing. And it basically, rather than designing campaigns around what the PCs are going to do, it designs campaigns about what the villains and enemies are going to do, which I really, really love. That's kind of the way that I prefer to do things even before I organized it in something along these lines. I do, however, find that Dungeon World, like many games that veer into story game territory, are not only both very jargony in a way that is jarring to me, but they're also very meta in how they're structured. And I was doing it a little bit more intuitively and a little bit more kind of just by, without really thinking about it, without having necessarily as much structure. And I found that the Dungeon World structure, while it was kind of nice because it explained what I was trying to do and it maybe helped keep me more focused on what I needed to do, it was too structured, too jargony, too meta, and I just really had a hard time wrapping my head around it. So it was a good idea that I found I was really struggling to implement in practice. There's another approach too. This is called the 5x5 method. This was published first on a blog post, and then it was updated, I think, in another version of the blog post. It got enough traction that it actually was published in Dungeon Magazine or Dragon, or maybe Dragon Magazine. I think it was Dungeon Magazine. Well, it was number 429, whichever it was. It was during the 4th edition era, and that issue of the magazine used to be available online as a PDF. I'm pretty sure that's where I found it. In fact, I think it's still up on Scribd if you have an account to that. But the way that it works is it creates a 5x5 matrix, and down each column is a kind of a separate story, if you will, or a separate challenge or conflict or whatever. And then the rows are steps for each of them. So there's 5 different challenges and 5 different rows or steps that make up each challenge. There's 5 different areas of it. What's supposed to happen is that some of these are in the same places, so as you're playing through your campaign, stuff kind of naturally mixes between all 5 columns, and you're not necessarily doing one column then another like modules per se. It's kind of more like broken up modules that you do all 5 of them at once, if that makes any sense. This is another method that I quite liked, but I don't really like. The thing that I don't like about it is that it's a little bit prescriptive, and it's still a method that kind of says this is what the PCs should be doing. And I don't really like to plan my games that way. I like to plan my games around what the villains are doing and let the PCs do what they're going to do about that. So what I've decided to do is that I kind of combine these two, get rid of the elements of both that I don't like, keep the elements of both that I do, and I basically have 5 villainous challenges or conflicts, and there's 5 steps. There is occasionally on some of them I kind of have a little bit of a prescriptive box on the 5x5 matrix, I suppose, but I really try to avoid having very many of them. I've been running games for a long time, and it's pretty easy to predict what most players are almost certainly going to do if I put certain, hooks or incentives or whatever in front of them. So I'm pretty confident in presuming that if I plan something that the PCs are going to choose to do it, but I don't really like to do too much of that because I prefer to let them decide what to do and then just plan the next session or two based on what they are doing and what they've decided to pursue. And even then, you've got to have a pretty good head for winging it and doing stuff by improvisation. So I came up for the Shadows Over Garenport campaign, and maybe it's more like a season of a campaign, like a TV show season, because I do have other campaigns that are also set in the same setting and would presumably use the same PCs and would follow this campaign. So I came up with a 5x5 matrix for this, and that's what I'm going to discuss over the next several videos. I'm going to have each of the columns as a separate video, and each of them, of course, will have 5 steps or 5 rows within them. But I do think that if I'm planning a campaign overall, I want to make sure that there's not too much overlap between the different types of columns, each of the different columns on the 5x5 matrix. So I want to vary the nature of the threats. I've said before, I think, that there are 3 potential themes in any Dark Fantasy X game, and frankly this is true for almost any game I would run no matter what system or setting. One of them is supernatural horror, one of them is crime and skullduggery, and then the third one is intrigue and espionage. These themes can overlap. Purveyors of political intrigue can use witchcraft or demonology to further their goals, of course, as can crime lords. But I want these fronts, these columns of this 5x5 matrix to have some variety. So I think that I need to think of them in terms of 2 axes. And one axis will be kind of brute force versus craftiness or sneakiness. And an invasion of an army is a brute force theme, while a plot to execute a sudden coup would be a crafty or discreet theme. Different columns in the fronts can operate on both ends of this axis, but to be more thematically coherent, each front should favor one end of the axis over the other, and then different fronts in the same game should be at different ends so the fronts don't have the same feel as each other. The second axis would be natural versus supernatural. A natural threat could be like Cardinal Richelieu and his henchman Rochefort and Milady de Winter from the Three Musketeers. Masterfully played, by the way, by Charlton Heston, Christopher Lee, and Faye Dunaway, respectively, in the best version of that story, which you can find on Amazon Prime. Any thriller set in any era will probably give you loads of examples of this type of threat, these natural threats. Dr. No, Ernst Blofeld, Solomon Lane, The Agency in the Bourne movies, The Mafia and The Godfather. On the supernatural end of the axis, we have guys who are very typical fantasy villains or horror villains. Monsters, dark wizards, your average Dark Lord of the Week, Vecna, either one, Strahd, Sauron, Orcus. Neither end of that axis should be a platonic ideal, of course. In a fantasy setting, it doesn't make sense that criminal or political masterminds wouldn't make use of supernatural resources. And even the most supernatural force in the fantasy world usually has Joe Blow human cultists running around a fair bit. But the theme and their goals are usually different. The natural mastermind wants to corner political power or something like that, like all of the masterminds mentioned above in the thriller examples, while the supernatural mastermind or supernatural threat wants to do something supernatural. Bring a powerful demonic entity into the world, cast some kind of super weapon, ritualistic spell, or something like that. And the endgame confrontations for these different fronts or different columns within the 5x5 for each will presumably be different. Either against a man or a woman or against a monster, basically. Although maybe the PCs can't face the main threat directly and have to defeat it some other way, either because the natural guy has an army of servitors and servants that a handful of plucky adventurers can never hope to fight head-on, or in the supernatural case because a demon lord or other super powerful lich or wizard is simply out of reach of even higher level PCs in most cases when it comes to direct confrontation. I like a front that focuses on crafty and supernatural probably the best, but then again, that's also the most commonly used in most RPG scenarios, modules, and adventures that I've seen. Most of the adventure paths from Paizo, for example, that I've read, or even read summaries of, do this. Most novels and movies will tend to have a supernatural threat that's often two-pronged. One is crafty and the other is brute force. Sauron sends spies in Ringwraiths to collect the ring, for instance, but also invades Gondor with a gigantic army, illustrating both ends of that axis. Saruman represents the smaller 5x5 front who mimics Sauron's. Thus, the Lord of the Rings has plenty of sneaking around with small groups, political intrigue, especially in Rohan and Minas Tirith, as well as big military stories to tell. Although telling big military stories is often harder when you need to focus on just a handful of characters. Tolkien does it well. Modules that I've read that have a military aspect of them usually don't. They usually default to the PCs who are nominally in command of the military, delegating that command to someone else so that they can be the super special strike team that goes and does some kind of surgical black ops type quest while the military is fighting the war off screen. So anyway, that's how I prefer to plan this. When I come back with my next video, I'm going to talk about the first column in Shadows Over Garenport, which is actually the column that the whole campaign is named for. It is the Shadows Over Garenport column. I will also have one that is focused on Northumbria, the northern region of the setting, or this portion of the setting. I have another one set on Southumbria, the southern region. I have another one set in the Darkling Sea, and features piracy and stuff like that. And then finally I have one up in Barrelharrow, which is north of the Darkling Sea, kind of on the northern frontier of the area that is in the scope of the setting. So I decided to divide each of these into geographical sections, but I also decided, again using the axes, that they would be kind of make sure that they're distinct. So the main first Shadows Over Garenport one is more of a supernatural and crafty threat. The Northumbrian one is more natural and more brute force. The Southumbrian one is kind of a combination of natural and supernatural, mostly brute force. The Piracy in the Darkling Sea is more natural, although there's a supernatural twist in it as well, and it's less brute force, although there are a few elements of brute force in it. And the Barrelharrow one is very supernatural, very small in scope. It's not much of a brute force. It's more sneaking around, solving mysteries, doing stuff like that. So, again, I want to make sure that all of the columns in my 5x5 matrix offer variety of theme, variety of challenges, the type of things that you're facing. And if you mix them up, then you kind of get a campaign that's got quite a bit of diversity of types of things that the players get to do with their characters, rather than it feeling like you're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again the entire time.